So, what I'm going to talk about today is why do we need humanitarians anyway? The course in Global Humanitarian Studies can be a little bit difficult to understand because humanitarianism isn't something we necessarily learn at school. It's a bit of a different topic. So, today we're going to talk about what humanitarians do, what humanitarianism is, and what you might get out of a course on humanitarian studies. And the first thing I want to say is that when we listen to the media or read the newspaper or scroll through social media, there seem to be a lot of terrible things going on in the world, disasters and wars and people suffering. And so, although it is a depressing topic, I feel like humanitarianism is, in many ways, a very positive career choice and a positive thing to study because it takes away the feeling of being powerless or not really understanding why disasters and crises happen. And it really puts you in the place of someone who's trying to do something about it. So keep that in mind while we go through this talk, please. So, what is the role of humanitarians? So, the key role of a humanitarian is responding to humanitarian need, and that is delivering assistance and help to people who are affected by disasters and conflicts and other kinds of crises anywhere in the world that they happen. So, many times national governments respond to disasters. But if they can't, in one particular point, if they are overwhelmed by an enormous disaster, then there is a gap between when a government can respond and help people. And this is the gap that humanitarians fill from an international perspective. So, what we see and learn about on the Global Humanitarian Studies course is when there's a gap that international humanitarian response must fill, what happens, how does it work, and how might you help? So, what is humanitarian need? I've said that humanitarians respond to humanitarian need. Now, this means people in need of something that will keep them alive. So this is an urgent need. And most often we talk about food, water, shelter, and healthcare. But as we'll see later, there are many other needs that people in crisis have. And currently, for 2025, it's estimated that there will be around 305.1 million people in humanitarian need. And so these are the people who need humanitarian assistance from the international system. So this need doesn't appear magically. There need to be systems and resources and funding available for this humanitarian response. So in 2025, it's predicted that it's going to cost 47.4 billion US dollars to respond to 189.5 million people in need. So we have this larger number of estimated people in need, but what the international system predicts that they are going to be able to help is 189.5 million people. This is because resources are limited, and depending on how domestic and international politics play out, there may be more or less money available every year. But nearly 50 billion US dollars is a lot of money, and the number of people that need to be helped are also a lot. So, why is there so much humanitarian need? So, first of all, we talk about disasters. And you may know a little bit or absolutely nothing about different kinds of disasters, which is totally fine. If you are still interested in the course, you will learn all about these things. Droughts, earthquakes, extreme temperature like heat waves and cold waves, floods, storms, and so on, occur everywhere in the world, and they always will. Natural hazards are natural. So we learn about why some natural hazards in some places may be increasing and why humanitarian need is maybe rising in some parts of the world because of these natural hazards that, because they impact so many people, can become disasters. We can see from this chart or this slide that that floods are the most common natural hazard in the world, closely followed by storms. So, if you are a humanitarian, you may find yourself preparing for and responding to floods and storms the most. But there are other large disasters that have happened very recently in the world, including droughts, earthquakes, and so on. So that the humanitarian response system, unfortunately, always has natural hazards to respond to. You may also see a lot in the news about climate change, and you may have learned about this in your previous studies. Now, greenhouse gas emissions are still rising, which is causing an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which means that our temperatures are increasing, which has led to many other different changes in the natural world. And so there are many predicted impacts and many impacts that are already being experienced because of climate change. And you can see in this slide that it shows impacts and drivers of climate change together in one place. But if we look at the outer ring, which is impacts, we can see that some of the impacts of climate change include from more extreme weather to food security, for example, from more extreme weather to risk in water supplies. There are also floodings of coastal regions that may be increasing in some parts of the world, damage to marine ecosystems. And what we're really saying here is that our world has many systems. And if a system like the climate system becomes imbalanced or changes, then there are many different impacts that can happen. And one of those that may be happening in some parts of the world is an increase in disasters. And finally, a large part of humanitarian response is focused on conflict. And so this is a chart that shows between 1946 and 2023 state-based armed conflict in the world. And I think my face covers up a little bit of this graph, but basically what it shows is that there are state-based conflicts all over the world, and particularly in Africa, they seem to be increasing in some ways. Now, this graph shows the number of state-based conflicts. So this graph shows that the number of conflicts is very high at the moment, or in 2023 when these assessments go to. But there's also real concern in the way wars are being fought. And in many conflicts currently in the world, we can see that civilian casualties are increasing. That means the way the wars are being fought now means that there are more civilians at risk and more civilians suffering, which means there is more humanitarian need. And this is a very big topic that's difficult to unpack in one slide, but it's something we also talk about during our course. So this is not to say that we need a giant disaster or a giant conflict in the world to have humanitarian levels of need. And we can see that the basis of some of this, I would say maybe much of this humanitarian need, is inequality. Now, inequality we can measure at a global level, or we can measure even within our communities, because even in wealthy countries like the UK, where here we are in London at UCL, we see people living on the streets and people homeless and people more vulnerable than others. And so what we need to consider is not only these large disasters and crises that lead to humanitarian need, we need to think about the underlying causes of why some people need more help than others. So When do humanitarians deploy? Now, deploy might be a bit of a strange term. It makes you sound like a missile, but we talk about humanitarians deploying to crises because a disaster happens and then they are flown to a particular case in order to help. And humanitarian response occurs because a national government requests help to the UN and the UN partners. UN is United Nations. And so, if you are part of the international humanitarian system, you might get an email or a call from your agency saying, oh, there's been an earthquake here or a flood here. Please, can you come and help? And you may be on a plane within 24 to 48 hours, depending on how these things work. So, when there's the gap in which national governments cannot cope with a disaster, they will call on people like humanitarians to come and help. And I've said before that humanitarians respond to humanitarian need, which is largely, most often, water, food, shelter, and healthcare. But there are many other things that humanitarians do. For example, we need experts in protection, which protect children and women, for example, in disaster cases. We need emergency telecommunications. For example, we all depend on our mobile phones, but if there's been a storm and all of the network infrastructure has been blown over, how do we communicate with each other in order to respond to these disasters? Logistics, experts in food and camp coordination, people who know how to plug in things, build things. There are so many different kinds of skills needed in the humanitarian world. This is a quick overview of the kinds of main things that occur. But let me show you another slide, which is what do humanitarians do? So you may be an expert in health or water or food or something like that. But that doesn't mean that these large agencies don't need a huge range of skills in order to operate well. So you might be into information management, which is data analysis, data collection, making graphs and charts or mapping. You might be interested in policy development. None of these actions can take place unless we learn from them and do better next time and capture all of our learning in policy, in guidance, and then in building the capacity and knowledge of national governments in order to improve humanitarianism. Diplomacy, negotiation, research and teaching, human resources, all of these roles are needed within the humanitarian system because the humanitarian system comprises of so many different kinds of agencies, from very, very large United Nations agencies to very, very small community-based organizations. So there are many different roles from many different themes in the humanitarian world. All of these different skills can be employed by different agencies. And I mentioned small community-based organizations and large United Nations organizations already. But most governments, local governments and national governments, are also very aware of disasters and crises, and they also employ people who have knowledge of humanitarian work. Hospitals are on the front line of disasters and crisis response. And so everyone from paramedics to police can be called first responders. And people who have humanitarian knowledge can also go into these kinds of careers. The Red Cross, Red Crescent movement are one of the world's largest humanitarian organizations, and they have lots of jobs going as well internationally. Private consultancy firms hire a lot of people who can do analysis and response in a humanitarian and disaster risk world. International insurance companies are also interested in people who understand risk and resilience. Those are two key words when we talk about disasters. So there are many different humanitarian related organizations that would hire people with a particular skill set and background like you would learn in Global Humanitarian Studies. We've also had people on the course who want to do something very different. For example, go into journalism or media or something like that. So the skills that you learn in Global Humanitarian Studies can be applicable to many different kinds of career as well. So in summary, humanitarians fill a gap when a disaster or a crisis exceed the capacity of the government to respond. Now, capacity is most often lacking in low income, climate affected, conflict affected countries. So, if you do become a humanitarian, you might find yourself working a lot in Asia or Africa or some poorer countries in Latin America. But that doesn't mean that humanitarian skills and humanitarian understanding is not needed in your own home country if you live in a wealthy country like the UK as well. Humanitarians come in many different disciplines and fill this gap in many different roles. And humanitarians gain skills from our course that can be applied in many different sectors, many different businesses. And they can be employed in many different ways. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to hand back to the main forum, and we'll see if you have any questions.